Hi everyone. In this lesson, we are going to sketch out some designs for some custom cable management devices. So there's a few different things that we might want to do with our cables coming off of our computer setup. One would be to keep the cables hanging off of the back organized. We have our equipment on our desk. It's a lot of cables hanging off the back side. We can add something on the back here to run these cables through to keep them from tangling up. Second, we can add something that we can attach to the top of our desk to hang on to chargers and other cables that we might need to reach so that they won't go falling back behind the desk. We'll need to create some shapes where we have an opening that will allow us to push a cable into it, but the opening will be narrow enough that the cables won't come falling back out of it. That way on the back of our desk, we can have some hooks. We can have our cables run down through them and stay where we put them. The top of the desk, I think we'll need something that has some gaps in it that are narrow enough that when we run a USB cable through them or some other charger, they won't be able to fall out the back, and that way we can keep them upright on our desk. It's a lot harder to draw these shapes than it is to visualize them in Tinkercad, so we'll go ahead and head over there and start building these shapes. And we are going to design some shapes for our custom cable managers. These should be very simple to print, but they'll require something like double-sided tape to affix them to the desk that you want to use them with. You can take these concepts and add onto them or customize them for the shapes of specific cables that you might have. So I'm going to take my examples and move them out of the way. And we're going to build our first little sideways cable manager. I'm going to start out using a tube. So you use the shape of this tube to create our holder here with a slot in it that we can snap cables into. So we want this to be flexible enough that it'll bend out of the way when we push our cables in, but not so thin that it might break. The default wall thickness for this is 2.5. We can go ahead and just change that to 2. A little bit thinner. 2.5 will probably work as well though. And like I always do, I'm going to increase the number of sides all the way up so that I get a smoother cylinder. At this point, it's really just aesthetic. Then we're going to need to cut a hole in our cylinder here so that we can push cables into it. So let's go ahead and grab a box from our basic shapes. And right now, if we look at the radius of our standard tube here is 10, so it's 20 millimeters across, which is plenty big enough for larger power cables. So I'm going to keep it at its default size there. And it's only 10 millimeters tall. So I think I'm going to raise this up to be 20 as well, just so that we have a larger area here it's less likely to be bent permanently or broken off. And we're going to want a narrow slot in here. So let's change the size of our hole to 5. And we can select both of our objects here and use the align tool and just quickly put them in the center. Now, of course, we don't want our hole to cut all the way through. We only want to cut a gap in one side. Let's zoom in here so we can see this better. We'll select our hole, and since we know it's centered, I'm just going to use the arrow keys to move it out of the way, so it's only going to cut through one side of my tube. And we're going to group these together before we add anything else, because I'm going to put some extra shapes on here, and I don't want them to get cut by our hole. So let's group this first. And now, while this might be functional, these sharp edges here could possibly grip or even cut into the edges of cables as we put them in and out of our cable organizer here. And we want this to be a little bit safer. So let's add cylinders in order to round out the edges. So we'll increase the sides up so it's nice and smooth. And we will shrink these corners down until we have some very small, say 3 millimeters looks good. And we want to cover up the sharp corners here with our round shape. You can see that if we move just a little bit in any direction, we're going a little too far. Since snap grid is set to 1 millimeter, we move 1 millimeter each time I push the arrow key, or every time you move it with the mouse, you go in 1 millimeter steps. I'll go ahead and change that down here to 0.5, so I can move it half a millimeter. Now I've got it so that we have our round shape here. It's covering up our pointy corner so it can't cut into anything, and it joins nice and smoothly in there without taking up too much of this space. Now I've got this one good. I'm going to duplicate it, and we'll use the arrow keys to just scoot it over until it matches up on the other side. So that's looking good. Now we've got a round container that can hold on to our cables as they go down, but we're going to be mounting it on the edge of a square shape, like the desk. So we're going to need a flat surface to affix our tape to. So we'll drag in another box. And let's zoom out a little bit so I can see this better. Let's make our box 4 millimeters thick. Maybe 3. There we go. And now we want our box here to be affixed to the back side of this. I can even go ahead and center it with our align tool. It looks like I got it already, so that's good. And when we join everything together, we'll have our shapes connected. So we have a flat surface on here and round surfaces here. And this will be thin enough to bend out of the way as we push cables into it. And we could make individual pieces like this and put a little piece of double-sided tape on the back and attach them anywhere we want. If we want to be able to create a large strip with the number of shapes here, we only have to create the first one and then duplicate as many as we want. Right now, my box here is 20 across, and so is this. So if I join the edges of these boxes together, let's duplicate or group this first, and then duplicate it. Our second one is going to be stuck together here. we won't be able to open each one of them. So we're going to need some extra space in between them. So let's delete that. We'll go here and ungroup. And then we'll change the size of our shape here. We want to have at least 5 millimeters in between these so that there's some space for them to bend outwards. So we're going to add 10 to this dimension. And let's zoom in here. And I can line this up later, but if I want to keep it centered, I can go ahead and hold down Alt while I drag this. I can drag it out to 30. But even if I get the wrong number here, if I have held down Alt when I click to drag this, it's going to move each side the same amount. I can go ahead and click on this number and change it to 30, and you'll see it still behaves the same way as it did when I held down Alt. If you hold down Shift, you can scale everything at once. So the same thing will happen if I hold down Shift and select this handle and then increase the size here. It's going to increase the size in every direction. So it remembers the key that you held down when you selected it, and it applies that transformation when you type in a number. Let's undo that. So now that I have this shape the size that I want, I'm going to group everything again. We will duplicate this and move it over until it just connects. So now I know that I have 5 extra millimeters sticking out of either side, so I have plenty of space. I can even overlap these just to make sure that they stay properly connected. And because I've made this one move after duplicating, I can hit duplicate and repeat again. And I can hit it as many times as I want to create a longer shape. Of course, it's quite easy to get long enough that it will never fit on your printer. Let's undo some of those. Now I have a setup for 4 cables here. I can go ahead and select all of them and group them together. And we've got one solid shape. And we can see that this will be easy to print since everything stands straight upright. It won't require any supports, and it'll have a flat surface to rest on the printer bed. So let's take a look at how we might make our second design, the top of the desk organizer. This shape is designed so that it will rest on the top of the desk, and the ends of charging cables can be hooked in here and hold on. So let's take this guy out of the way, and let's recreate this. We're going to make it modular just like our previous one, so we can make it exactly as long as we want it to be. Let's go ahead and bring out a box here. And we're going to use this as the basic size of our shape here. We're going to make the bottom floor. Change this to 3. Then we're going to create a back wall there. So we're going to duplicate this box that we already have. Shrink it and then raise it up. And the precise measurements of this aren't too critical, but we do have to make sure that the slot that we make in it is big enough to fit the cables. Most of the small charging cables are 3 or 4 millimeters across. So we're going to go ahead and grab another box to make a hole. We'll make this slot 5 millimeters as well. So let's select this, change this to 5. And we're going to go ahead and center all of these objects. So let's go to the Align tool, center everything, and we'll line it up the backside there. And we don't want our slot to go all the way through the floor and cut this thing in half. So let's take our box and just raise it up. And now we will add an overhang here to hook onto anything that is set in here so it can't slide up and fall right off. And just to make it nicer and smoother, we're going to use a roof. Let's get our round roof here. And we're going to need to rotate it. Click on our rotate handle facing down. Keep it inside the circle so we can snap it to 90 degrees. And then we can place this in position here. So I can use our hold down shift, click on this back wall. We'll use our align tool. We don't want our back wall to move, so I'll click on this back wall again. We'll center it and we'll line it up with the back edge there. And also line it up with the top. All right. So our roof is a little bit too big. We need a big enough slot here that we can actually get our piece or end of our cable to rest in there. So we'll click on an empty space. We'll click on the roof again and click on Fit to View to zoom in. Let's make sure that this is small enough by looking at it from below. So right now, if I look at it from below, our height measurement, our handle here, will move to the bottom. So I can move the bottom up rather than moving the top down. And we can make a fairly large gap here. And we'll move it back a little bit. Actually, I will move the top up a little so it has a curve at the top and doesn't end up with a little jagged edge. So that's looking good. You can see that our slot here is going to cut through the top as well as partway through the back wall. I think I want this to move down a little bit. I need this to have enough space to keep our cable underneath our little overhang here. So let's select our hole again. We'll drag it down so it cuts through the back wall but does not cut through the floor. All right, now that we have design for one module of our design, we can select everything, group it together. We'll check that our hole is in the right place and everything. And then we can decide how many of these cable slots we need and use the same duplicate trick as we did on our previous one. So I'm going to make a 4-part design. I've hit duplicate. I'm going to use the arrow keys to move it over so that it doesn't accidentally move backwards or forwards. I'm going to go so that it has a little bit of an overlap. I don't want the slots too close together so that if we have larger plugs, they'll be bumping into each other. But I do need them to overlap enough that they'll be one solid object. So now that I've got this move in position, I can hit duplicate and repeat, and we'll repeat the same move a couple more times. So I'll make a unit that has 4 slots in it. Select all of these objects and group them together once more. And now the only thing that's necessary for this one is to rotate it so that we don't have an overhang. If we print this way, we'll end up with a whole lot of support that we need to dig out from underneath our slots here. And we are going to set up our two cable management modules to print. Since we have two different designs here, I'm going to export them as two separate STL files. We'll go ahead and select this one, hit export, and choose STL. Select the other one, hit export, making sure we're only including the selected shape so we don't get our other examples, and STL. You can select multiple objects or export everything if you want to, but keep in mind the position relative to each other is locked in place once you make it an STL. If I created an STL from the two of these, they would always be this distance apart, which might make them harder to fit onto your print. But since I have them as two separate objects, I can bring them into the print and arrange them however I want. So let's go ahead and head over to Cura. Now that we're in our slicer, I'm going to go in here and open up both of the cable organizers at once. Already we can see that it has placed them as close together as it possibly can, so that they are quicker to print since we don't have to move so far in between them as we are printing our layers. If we had them separated apart in a single STL file, we wouldn't be able to move them closer together. However, right now we still have the overhang problem in this one. I'm going to set this down to a lower quality. Keep in mind that the quality actually means the height of the layer. And the height of the layer just determines how thick each line is as it prints them out. So when we're printing layers directly on top of each other, as I slice this, we'll see in our preview that our object that is stacked straight up and down, the thickness of the layers won't change much. You might see the layer lines a little better with thicker layers, and they'll become smoother with thinner layers. But because they are all the walls are going straight up, it won't have a significant difference. And since we're not entirely worried about the aesthetic smoothness of the outside of this, we can print it at the thickest possible layer height in order to print this faster. However, our shape here has a curve and an overhang. So at the lowest quality, if I scroll down here, we can see that each step of the curve is quite a large move. And that means that our curved shape is going to look a little bit like steps. And if we increase the quality, this curve is going to get a lot smoother. Since it sits on top of the desk, we might actually want to print it smoother just so that it looks nicer. The other problem that this has is once we get to our overhang, we have a layer here where we're printing a huge area that just sticks out over empty space. So our liquid plastic is just going to droop down and become a terrible mess. Luckily, this design has a flat side on the back. So we can go back into our prepare here. We'll select our shape, and we'll use the rotate to switch this thing 90 degrees. So that now it is resting on the back surface here. We can also rotate this in Tinkercad before we import it. But once you have your object in, if you need to change the position or even the scale, you can do that inside of the slicer. So let's take a look. Keeping our supports off, slice this again, and look at the preview. So now we can see that everything has something underneath it. So our shapes here are not going to have a problem with the overhang, but with the very low quality of the layers, the ends of our curve here are going to get rather stepped. That might not be a big concern, but if we want to design this one so that it's a lot smoother, we could increase the quality. That, however, is going to increase the amount of time that it takes to print everything. And since this one doesn't need it, I would print this one separately in order to print it at a higher quality. So we can make this its own separate print job at a higher quality for the smoothness and leave the larger one at the low quality in order to print it faster. For now, I'm going to print both of these to test them out. I'll print them at low quality so I can make my first test print as fast as possible. Let's save the G-code file. We're ready to print.